There we are. This is the 28 Minutes of Sanity podcast. My name is JJ. My good friend Paul is here as always. If Paul wasn't here, we couldn't do this. How's it going, Paul?
I'm pretty good, and you could very well do this if I wasn't here.
No.
Yes, you could.
Everyone listening and watching knows the truth. So thanks, Paul, for hanging in there. We don't have a guest this week. We are continuing a dialogue with our friend Steve. But before we dive in, I want to remind you, if you want to follow us on Twitter, it's at 28min of sanity. Give us a follow. Send us a note, as Steve did, 28minutesofsanity at gmail.com. I do want to say just a couple things. One, I've said this before, but I've really been excited about the guests that we've had and some of the conversations or interviews we've been able to do, and I really appreciate that. And as I've mentioned, we've got some more coming up that I'm really excited about and looking forward to it. One disclaimer, if you're doing this via YouTube, I'm wearing a BYU hat, and I do not necessarily endorse the theology of BYU, but they gave me this free hat, and I'm happy to wear it. So they've got that going for them, and I appreciate it. Also, if you can faintly hear music playing, that's probably some angels approaching, or Travis is practicing right outside the walls of our studio. So, hey, Travis, we love you, and we're not too mad that you decided to pick this moment to practice. So that's what's going on. If you've been tracking all of our episodes, we got an email from an actual person, not named Steve, a few weeks ago, and we responded to it. And Steve sent us a fairly lengthy response back. And in saying lengthy, I don't mean that to be critical. We're dialoguing on a bunch, and in a perfect world, this would maybe be like a physical discussion, but that's not the way it's played out. And so we responded to some of the stuff that Steve said in the first email, and he sent a thoughtful reply back. And as I said before, I don't know how many times we're going to keep doing this, but we decided to go ahead and do it this week because we want to respect Steve's perspective and hopefully model what good dialogue looks like. And so we're going to jump in. I don't think, because of the length of it, and it's not overly long, but because of the length of it, I'm not going to read the whole thing. I think I did that last time, but I will probably have Paul post it on the YouTube video. And so if you actually want to make sure we're giving Steve a fair shot and not cherry picking comments, the full email will show up on the YouTube video. So if you're listening online, if you want to stop and go watch the YouTube just long enough so you can see the full letter, you can sure do that. But what I've decided to do, there's 4 lengthy paragraphs that you'll be able to see on the YouTube video. And so I've just highlighted a few things that Steve has said in response to our previous podcast. And if you're jumping around, go back and listen to the first one first. I think it's called Response to an Atheist or Letter from an Atheist. Does that sound right, Paul?
Yeah, something like that.
Something like that. So watch that one first so you can, so you can get the full context of the dialogue, and you're not just showing up mid discussion. And so some of this might repeat a little bit, but I think the value of repeating some things is it clarifies where some of the disagreements are, and I think there's a lot of value in that. Something I've noticed, this is not directed at Steve, but in general, we do not ask the right questions. One of my heroes, Philip Johnson, actually wrote a book called The Right Questions because the way we frame something might be as important as the answers we arrive at. And I think that good thinking, good reasoning means asking our questions very, very carefully. And so having said that, I'm just going to jump right in, and the 4 paragraphs, give some response to each one. First major paragraph, and again, Steve, thanks. Steve's made it clear, and I think we've made it clear that this is a real respectful dialogue. There's no personal animus here. And I love that. I'm thankful for that. So having made that clear, the first extended paragraph, Steve wrote a little ways in, with that thought, I think that a more fitting word for my belief is that a meta-narrative is currently unknown. And just wanted to respond to that phrase or that claim that a meta-narrative is currently unknown. Steve, I think what you're doing there is taking your position, which I take you at your word that you're exploring, and you're saying that you don't know which meta-narrative that is out there is accurate, or if there is another one. We all, to some extent, assume that some meta-narrative is real. And when we use the term meta-narrative, we're talking about the overarching true story of reality. And right now we live in a world of competing meta-narratives. There's a competition to determine which story is the accurate one. And I made some notes. The three that I'm most familiar with, one is the naturalistic story. And that story basically is the standard story that says that there's ultimately no creator, no author to this story, and that the molecules are all that exist. And given enough time, et cetera, those molecules through a kind of blind trial and error have moved the world from simple to complex, and that's the story of how humans got here, and that shapes how we view ethics and how we view the future and how we view each other, how we do science and that kind of thing. Lately, I've been reading a lot about the Marxist meta-narrative, and real oversimplification, but the Marxist narrative is more about the future than the past. The Marxist narrative says that the past has been a kind of power struggle, and the future represents the victory, a kind of victory of the oppressed in that power struggle. But all those assumptions have to be held up to scrutiny, as Steve would agree with. We need to compare these meta-narratives to reality, to the evidence, to the things that we experience, to try to see how accurate they are. And of course, the meta-narrative that I think best explains our experience here is the theistic meta-narrative, the idea that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and that the problems in the world, the sense that something's not right, are best explained in moral terms and in terms of our relationship with God, our rebellion toward God. And the resolution that has begun and is coming is based on what Christ did in the world, and that's knowable, and that clarifies how we view the future. And so we can, and of course there's dozens of others, but those are three of the major ones. We can take a look at the claims of those meta-narratives, and we can see if they match up well with our experience. And of course, all this dialogue assumes that our experiences are knowable, that our memories are not perfect, but generally accurate, that our senses are not perfect, but generally accurate, that our ability to reason from premises to a conclusion, we don't do that perfectly, but we can do that with a degree of accuracy. And I'm persuaded, obviously this won't be convincing for you, Steve, but I'm persuaded that those kinds of experiences, the theistic meta-narrative makes the most sense of those experiences that we all have, whether you're a naturalist, whether you're a Marxist, whether you're a Muslim, whatever you might be. The theistic and specifically the Christian story makes the most sense of those things. And so that's what I'm claiming. And so the blanket statement that a meta-narrative is currently unknown, I would say unknown by whom? By some, for sure. But those of us who claim to know the meta-narrative can argue and debate, and I think, again, whether convincing or not, that the Christian story makes the most sense, makes better sense within those arguments. So, Steve, you wrote, though I would consider myself a methodological naturalist, and I hope this is fair, Steve, that you would agree that that means that when we do science or when we do epistemology, we assume that naturalism is true. And my challenge to you is, why would you do that? That is making a rule in advance that assumes something about the world. And if you assume a thing to be true about the world, of course, then that limits your outcomes. If I assume that I'm not going to find the work of God when I do science or when I study history or whatever, of course, then my conclusions have to be naturalistic. And so that violates a pretty basic rule. Now, Steve, I think you would say that any epistemology, you have to assume things on the front end, and I would agree with that. So let's have the discussion on what is reasonable to assume on the front end. And I think it's reasonable to assume kind of what I already articulated, that our senses are generally accurate, our memories are generally accurate, our ability to reason is generally accurate, not perfect. And then what makes the best sense of those experiences? And so that's my overall response to paragraph 1. Paragraph 2, I think I'm going to read the whole thing here and comment on some of it, and just point out some things, point out some of the limits on my own perspective, just for the sake of honesty, but also point out that there are some problems in here that should be addressed. So I'm going to read the whole paragraph here. So quoting you directly, Steve, the second idea I would like to respond to is the idea of standards within morality and beauty. And to step out of reading the paragraph for a second, I claimed on that last podcast that even if we can't know everything perfectly, that concepts of truth and goodness and beauty are measured against an objective standard. And we can know things about that standard, even if we don't know it perfectly, that standard exists. And Steve, you're pushing back on that, pushing back on some of my examples. So back to quoting you. I think that this is Steve talking, I think that a big area of misunderstanding between Christians and atheists is that claiming that these things are subjective does not mean that there are no standards at all for beauty or morality. It simply means that not everyone agrees what the standards should be. I absolutely have a baseline for morality and beauty, but that is not shared by everyone on the planet, nor do I claim to be the perfect arbiter of either. I have no problem saying that steak is tastier than soap, that Ellie Mae is more attractive than Granny, or that Starry Night is a more beautiful piece of artwork than a stick figure. No offense to Paul. But on an objective level, it is possible that these are people who would genuinely find the other option more attractive. Maybe someone hates steak to the point that they would rather have soap in their mouth or even likes the flavor of soap. If Granny's husband had still been alive on the show, he would probably be more attracted to her than to his granddaughter. It's possible that an art critic absolutely detests Van Gogh to the point that a stick figure would be more palatable to him. But even if everyone on earth agreed with our conclusions about which was more beautiful in each scenario, that is not an argument that our conclusions are objective. That would be a fallacious argument ad populum. And so I'm going to address some of what you wrote here, Steve. First, I want to challenge when you said early on in the paragraph, I'm going to requote, I think that a big area of misunderstanding between Christians and atheists is that claiming that these things are subjective does not mean that there are no standards at all for beauty or morality. It simply means that not everyone agrees what the standards should be, you wrote. And Steve, I don't think that's an accurate way to characterize this disagreement. To claim that that beauty or morality is subjective is not the same as claiming that not everyone agrees what the standards are. I listen to people discuss all the time a moral argument, for example, an argument about a particular area of morality, and both sides assume that there is a moral measuring stick, that there is a moral law, and yet they debate about the details of that moral law, but they're both moral absolutists. Okay, so the existence of a disagreement on a moral question or a question of beauty does not mean that those things are not absolute. It just means that two people disagree on the facts in a specific case. Okay, and so when you cite examples of someone disagreeing, the possibility of somebody disagreeing with the examples that I gave, Steve, I agree with you that is possible. Okay. But in each case, I think that I can make a strong case that the person disagreeing with me is mistaken. Okay. We take into account the existence of bias. And so the fact that Granny's hypothetical husband thinks that Granny is more attractive, I agree that he likely does think that and has personal psychological reasons for thinking that. Another example of this would be, often when I've shared this, someone will say, well, does that mean I can't care about my kids' artwork? Your kids, they make you these little pictures and they're adorable to you. And I've had that experience as a dad. Your kids draw you something, they make you a card, whatever, and it moves you, and that card or that artwork is precious to you and you enjoy it. I've still got folders of these things in my house. Okay. But and that calls up a different kind of beauty. All right. Because when I look at that picture, I know, or I sense the purity of the act. All right. The fact that my little daughter drew me a picture, and there is a beauty in the act of creating that picture that is more valuable to me than Van Gogh's Starry Night. Okay. And so we're bringing in a different kind of beauty to, in one sense, muddy the waters, right? But if I call in 10 people who are really refined in their views of beauty, and they don't know anything about Van Gogh, and they don't know anything about my daughter, they can objectively say that the skill level that Van Gogh needed to create Starry Night is more impressive than the skill level that my daughter showed in making the stick figure. Okay. Now, that's not in any way minimizing a child making a stick. There is beauty in that. And the ability for a child to create art at all and to delight in creating art is actually an amazing thing. We're not downgrading that, all right? But we're saying there is a progression, and that what Van Gogh was able to do displays a level of skill and in the creation of beauty far beyond what a 5-year-old can do, even if they are pure in heart, and even if there is a separate but real kind of beauty in what they're doing. Okay. It's also possible and hopefully likely that a man in a marriage will find his wife more attractive. And that's a good thing about the world. Okay. But there is a gradation of beauty and reality. Steve, you said something at the end of the paragraph. You wrote this, let me find the specific thing that you wrote. Here it is. But even if everyone on earth agreed with our conclusions about which was more beautiful in each scenario, that is not an argument that our conclusions are objective. That would be a fallacious argument ad populum. I'm going to push back on that a little bit. Steve, it is true that a thing being popular does not automatically make it true. Okay, I agree with that. But the opposite of that, the opposite conclusion, I don't think can be drawn either. all right, if you go to a town and there's 1,000 people in that town and they all agree on a particular thing, every single one of them agrees that a certain thing is true, and you start to ask them why they think that thing is true, they may not be able to articulate their reasoning perfectly, but when a belief is widespread, some accounting has to be done for that. You have to give an accounting for why is it widespread that so many people think that 2 + 2 is 4? Why is it widespread that so many people think that steak tastes better than soap? Why is it all the clear case examples I've given? Why are those thought processes widespread? There is something there that seems to call out in us an idea that we can know things. All right, and if a belief is widespread, that doesn't make it true, but it makes it compelling. We need to give an accounting for why a belief is widespread. And so the fact that I appeal to that, I don't think it is argument ad populum, okay? It's only that if that's my only argument, right? But I can marshal other arguments for this being the case. And so I want to push back on what you wrote there, Steve. Moving on to paragraph 3, I highlighted something else that you wrote, specifically regarding morality. And you wrote, Steve, that the determination also has to be made that human thriving is what we should be striving for. And there well, first off, I agree with you. We should strive for human thriving. But then my question is, why do you and I automatically know that? Why do we want that to be the case? Why is that a good? Why is human thriving better than distinction? Why is human thriving better than extinction? Is what I meant to say. The only explanation for that intuition, I believe, is that we have some knowledge baked in that human beings are created for something, and there's an automatic recoiling at cruelty. Your Marvel villains who want to wipe out a big percentage of the population, we don't have to explain why they're villains, okay? So, Steve, you and I are agreeing on this case. And so my question is, what gives the best accounting for the fact that we kind of know that human thriving is good? And then the question moves on to what makes for human thriving. And some basic knowledge about that gives us position to make a kind of judgment that you referenced. In the next line, you said this, but my conclusions are radically different than that of the ancient Aztecs. And yes, I would say that my standards are better than that of the Aztecs, but only when I have an objective standard to compare it to. All right? And again, we roughly agree on what the standard is, that for the Aztecs to have practiced human sacrifice was evil. And at least for the humans being sacrificed, they didn't thrive in that system. You went on to say, I don't think I highlighted it, but I want to see if I can find it. Here it is. You wrote, and to be fair, the Aztecs also had the goal of human thriving, but had some egregious misinformation on how that could be best achieved. Steve, I'm going to argue that the Aztecs' problem was not misinformation. They hadn't thoughtfully come to the conclusion that human sacrifice would make their lives better, but they had gone through the course of actively dehumanizing certain people in violation of their own conscience. It wasn't a math error or a logic error that led them to practice human sacrifice. It was them willingly violating their own consciences and practicing this for reasons that are frankly morally insane. And so, the idea that they just had the wrong facts, I don't think that holds up. We've had too many experiences where you can give someone all the facts they need to make an obvious good choice that's going to lead to the kind of thriving that we would both agree on, and they still don't make that choice. It's a moral problem, not an informational problem. And so just want to, again, feel like most of what I'm doing is pushing back on the points that you're raising, but all with the end goal of doing what I believe is showing that the theistic worldview has a better way of explaining all these things than any other worldview, which is why one of the reasons that I'm a Christian. Okay. Steve, you did specifically address Scripture. And so in paragraph 4, I want to point that out. You wrote this: to begin, grab my papers here. To begin, I would like to point out that I don't toe the line of secularism, and I appreciate that about you, Steve. I certainly have some agreements, but just because a secularist says a certain thing or a secular society allows a certain action does not mean that I agree with it. I appreciate that. I really don't care that there are modern secular societies that practice slavery. You went on a little bit later. Personally, it sounded like a lot of your argument rested on whataboutism, saying that there's slavery in modern secular society. So why do I have the right to judge the Bible for not condemning the practice? And I would just point out, Steve, in your first letter, you wrote, we have essentially declared slavery as bad and a violation of human rights as a global society. So my response was simply pointing out that I don't think that's the case. I came up with several counterexamples to that claim. That's not whataboutism. That's simply taking your claim at face value. Okay. But I do want to take a minute to some extent address your handling of Scripture, Steve. You cited specifically Exodus 21, 20 through 21. And let me read that real quick and then read what you wrote about it. That passage, Exodus 21, 20 and 21, says this: when a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. But if the slave survives a day or two, he is not to be avenged, for the slave is his money. And you've interpreted that verse a particular way. So here's what you wrote in your most recent email. You said, I would also like to clarify with my argument on the death penalty for slavery. What I meant by that is that Yahweh clearly did not have a problem with using the death penalty for certain actions. So why not for something like slavery? I probably should have worded that argument better by asking why Yahweh takes breaking the Sabbath more seriously than slavery, rather than bringing the idea of the death penalty into it. So I appreciate what you're doing, Steve, but I want to bring some clarity here and just point out a couple of things about this passage and its context. And in doing so, I want to be real careful because, well, I'll get to in a minute, like a broader concern that I have that I'll probably close this out with. But what I want to point out, what you've said about this passage, I don't think it holds up even under pretty direct scrutiny within the passage. It said, I'm going to read it again. When a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. The implication with the word avenged, at least according to some interpreters, is that the death penalty is to be applied to the slave owner who murders his slave. All right? And that does not comport with what you've said, that Yahweh doesn't condemn slavery. Okay? Explicitly, the death penalty appears to be being called for here for the murder of a slave. That is actively, relative to the rest of the world at that time, elevating the humanity of the slave in this case. All right? And then the second part of the verse that seems to imply that assault is okay, Um, the verse says this, but if the slave survives a day or two, he is not to be avenged, for the slave is his money. And there's no way I can say everything about this verse other than to say what this is doing is limiting the kind of criminal penalty that can be applied to a slave owner if the slave does not die in this instance. But part of what is implied here when it says the slave is his money, that sounds, I agree with you that interpretation sounds dehumanizing, okay? But in the broader context, there is, given all of the safeguards that are in place around slavery and the way that the Old Testament law actually was represented progress for the humanity of the slave relative to the surrounding world. Again, this is a complex topic, okay? But it represents progress. This is saying the slave owner has an incentive not to kill his slave because his economic the slave's economic worth is bound up in the life and the health of the slave. Okay, this is not the complete answer to this question, all right? But I believe that reality can help clarify or nuance the discussion. The discussion itself is very complicated. I don't pretend to have all the answers, but what I do want to do is point out that your claims that Yahweh is casual about slavery, just within the context of the passage, do not hold up. Let me back up. Same passage, verse. Let's start in verse 15, okay? And I'm not going to defend all of this, all right? But he says this, whoever strikes his father or his mother shall be put to death, all right? Now, on its face, that makes Yahweh seem really harsh, right? And yet, in the context, you've got a group of people wandering in the wilderness, and survival is essential, and social order is essential. And if Yahweh does not communicate that a serious thing is serious, order will break down, and these people ultimately will die. Okay? So does that offend our modern sensibilities? Of course it does. Does Yahweh have a right to put down real markers with his people ultimately for their good, to communicate, look, if you do not, kids, if you don't take your parents seriously, it is bad for the whole group. All right? And without going into detail on this, Yahweh, I believe, has a right to do that. Okay? There's much more that could be said about this. And I know that I'm leaving myself open to, did he just say that? I'm saying that there's some broader principles here that matter. Okay? And when this group of people are wandering around in the desert and certain things are going to make it impossible for them to survive, Yahweh has a right to say, no, some things have to be taken very, very seriously. And so respect for parents must be taken seriously. I'm not going to mess around about this, okay? Next verse 16. Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him, shall be put to death. So, Steve, you have claimed that Yahweh isn't that concerned about slavery. That's my understanding between the two emails, that he doesn't condemn slavery. All right? But I need you, just as we need to give an accounting for the verses you mentioned, verse 16 we have to give an accounting for. Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him, shall be put to death. All right? So this is speaking to how someone may enter into slavery. And if a kidnapping happens, and that kidnapping results in the person being sold into slavery, the death penalty is called for by Yahweh. Okay? So the very thing that you have proposed is present there in verse 16. All right? There's a big marker that someone should not be kidnapped. and sold into slavery. Yahweh says, do not do that, and offers the death penalty for it. Okay? So, once again, I'm not pretending to have a complete understanding of all of these issues. They're historically and culturally very complex. I'm pointing out to you that you've offered us a really simplistic interpretation of verses 20 and 21, and within the context, they simply do not hold up. Okay? And again, this could raise a whole bunch of questions. I freely acknowledge that. And we can go down this road. But I am going to repeat what I said last time. As far as the bigger picture goes, to say that Yahweh doesn't condemn slavery, he certainly condemns certain forms of it, as we just saw from verse 16. And also the meta-narrative of Scripture, there is an argument there in the Edenic state, the state that God created and called good. Slavery, as we understand it, did not exist. And in the Christian story, when Christ returns to set up the new heavens and the new earth, there's no sign that slavery as we know it will exist. Okay? So there is an implicit condemnation of slavery in that. The ideal state that God has us set up for, there is not slavery. Now, this imperfect place that we're in the middle of right now, slavery does exist in different forms, and there are certainly debates to be had over how best to get rid of it. And those debates have been going on for a long time. But to extrapolate from that God is okay with slavery does not fully make sense of all the biblical data that we have. And so so I'm going to keep pushing back on that. I do want, kind of in closing, in thinking this through, I want to address something that, Steve, I'm not necessarily accusing you of this, but I think we need to generally be cautious about. Two of my favorite thinkers are C.S. Lewis and Robert George. C.S. Lewis, I think, needs no introduction. Robert George is a professor of either law or philosophy at Princeton. He's a pretty bright dude. And C.S. Lewis has talked about chronological snobbery, or the idea that we tend to kind of take for granted the way things are and look back at history, at some of the awful things that you can see in history, and strongly condemn or pass judgment on the people at that time. Okay? And have blind spots to the things that are going on right now. And I've noticed that tendency in the general discourse of the world today. I condemn slavery as it was practiced in the American South. Okay? It also costs me nothing to make that condemnation, right? Because there, as you said, there is by and large broad cultural agreement. And the exceptions that I pointed out, I'm just connecting them to secularism. And when secularism starts to flourish, slavery starts to make a comeback. Having said that, we still have general cultural agreement that slavery is bad. I'm just pointing out that it doesn't cost me a thing to say that, right? I don't have to worry about getting canceled for saying slavery was bad. It's very easy for me to say that. And Robert George has talked about his freshman philosophy classes. He'll ask them, and he'll say, how many of you in this room believe that you would have opposed slavery had it been practiced widely at the time? And every hand goes up. And he argues that that is delusional. All right? To oppose slavery at the time when it was commonplace cost those who did it an awful lot. And so we flatter ourselves. We say, well, of course I would have opposed slavery. Of course I would have stood up against Hitler. Of course I would have marched with Martin Luther King for equal rights. But we are no different morally than our grandparents, than our great-grandparents, than our great-great-grandparents. And many of them, for often complex reasons, chose to go along with what was prevailing in the culture. And it is very easy, and it costs us nothing to sit in judgment of our grandparents and our great-grandparents for not being as moral as we tell ourselves we would have been in those situations. And so the real question is, are we willing to swim upstream today against the things that if we can pull back and examine some of the things that are going on in the world, and solving them is actually very complex. What kind of price am I paying to discover how to make the world genuinely a better place? How to work for human thriving? What does that even mean? What price am I willing to pay? Because I guarantee you, I'm debating in my head right now whether to give examples or not. If you know me well, you know the kinds of examples that I would give, but the specifics don't matter so much as the fact that in 40 years, in 60 years, in 100 years, thoughtful people are going to look back on 2022 and say, they put up with that? Maybe I'll not give an example. How did they not know? Who pushed back on that? And then we're going to say, wait, there were some people who did push back. They had the kind of moral vision to say, no, we need to fight against this, okay? And so I want to compare the two things. How easy it is to condemn our grandparents for not being as moral as we think we would be, and then how difficult it is to actually notice and push back against modern evil that it's harder to notice because it's commonplace and because we very genuinely have lives to live and mouths to feed and jobs to go to, and the list could go on and on. But I just want to close out with saying that I think Robert George is right, that most of us probably wouldn't have opposed the evil that was right in front of us because it was so commonplace. And let that serve as a wake-up call to not simply accept the world as it's been presented to us as normal and good, but compare it to a standard that I'm convinced ultimately is found in Scripture. What does God say about these things? What does the God of the Bible say about these things? And am I willing to pay a price to love God, to love my neighbor, to stand up for what God has said is right, rather than just the direction the winds are blowing today? All right. And Steve, I'm not making an accusation against you personally. I'm suggesting that is how the question needs to be framed based on the history of how these things go and how normal, what I believe normal moral formation looks like. And so Steve, that's my response. Back to you. To say it again, I appreciate the good-natured feedback / pushback, the dialogue. And Steve, to be fair, as I've had people talk about these podcasts, I do not have answers to every one of your questions. I'm not an art major. I haven't studied ethics at the PhD level. But I don't think anyone needs to do that to come up with basic answers to some of these questions that you've offered. So, Steve, you are welcome to reply back. I'll say again what I've said before. Don't know if we're going to keep this dialogue going or not, but I think it's good for our listeners, for our viewers to hear some of these discussions. Hopefully, to think about some things that they haven't thought about before. I know people have done that for me over the years, and so right now I'm just kind of passing on what I believe the favor that's been done to me, passing it on to our viewers and listeners. Paul, I didn't even give you a chance to weigh in. I got rolling. We talked before. We didn't know if we would have 28 minutes of content or not, but here we are, well over 28.
And I had the most deep theological answers to just give everything we needed to hear.
Right.
And now we don't have time, so sorry about that.
So had you been around at the time, you would have done the right thing, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
all right.
exactly.
Perfect example of what we're talking about. So anyhow, Appreciate those of you who tune in, those of you who listen, the kind comments. Steve, for the pushback, we welcome that as well. And so we appreciate you listening and watching. If you would follow us on Twitter at 28min of sanity. If you do want to give us feedback, 28minutesofsanity@gmail.com. We welcome it, and we hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.